There's something most people don't know about Minato Namikaze. He existed long before the story ever told us who he really was. When Masashi Kishimoto was first building the world of Naruto, he sketched out the Fourth Hokage as a piece of history, a figure carved into the great stone faces of the village before Naruto's parents were ever part of the plan. So for years, readers only knew this man as a mystery, a blonde silhouette on the Hokage rock, a ghost of a leader who had already given his life for the village, with no name attached, no backstory, no explanation. He was simply there, watching over everything from the mountain, and no one knew why he mattered so much. And that quiet presence fit him strangely well. The name Minato itself means harbor or port, a place of safe passage, a calm point where ships come to rest. It's a gentle name, one that suggests stillness and shelter. But there's a quiet irony in that, because Minato's entire legend was never built on stillness at all. It was built on speed. He became known as the Yellow Flash, a man so fast that enemies were told to flee on sight, a warrior whose reputation alone could end a battle before it began. So the harbor, the calm resting place, turned out to be one of the fastest men the world had ever seen. The name and the myth pulling in opposite directions. Now, here's where the creation story gets interesting. Kishimoto didn't design Minato's face by accident. When you look at him, the bright blonde hair, the shape of the eyes, the calm confidence in his expression, you're really looking at something deliberate. Kishimoto has said that Minato was drawn to look almost exactly like an adult version of Naruto, and he did this on purpose. He wanted readers to feel a connection before a single word confirmed it. He was planting a seed, a quiet visual clue, hidden in plain sight, so that the bond between these two characters would register in your mind long before the story ever spelled it out. So think about what that means. For years, fans were staring at the Fourth Hokage, feeling something familiar without being able to explain it. They saw Naruto's face in his. They noticed the resemblance, the shared features, the same golden hair. But because the connection was never stated, it stayed just beneath the surface. A suspicion, a hunch, a feeling that these two were somehow linked. And that's exactly what Kishimoto wanted. He was letting the audience do the emotional work on their own, slowly, without even realizing it. And that patience paid off in a way few plot points ever do. When the truth finally arrived, when it was revealed that Minato Namikaze was Naruto's father, it didn't land like a shocking twist. It landed like a confirmation, like the answer to a question you'd been carrying for a long time without knowing you were asking it. Because fans had subconsciously suspected it for years, the reveal hit as an emotional gut punch rather than a surprise. It felt true. It felt earned. All those quiet clues, all that hidden resemblance, suddenly clicked into place at once, and the weight of it settled in gently, the way something obvious does the moment it's finally said out loud. But what's really surprising comes next. You would think a character this beloved, this central to the emotional heart of the series, would be someone we spend a lot of time with, a mentor figure, present through the story, guiding events from the front. But the truth is almost the opposite. Minato has remarkably little screen time while he's actually alive. He appears mostly in flashbacks, glimpses of the past, brief windows into who he was, scattered moments pulled from memory. We see the end of his story far more often than the living man himself. And here's the strange part. That scarcity didn't shrink his legend. It grew it. Because we saw so little of him, our imagination filled in the rest. The gaps became part of the myth. Every flashback felt precious, precisely because there were so few of them. We were told he was the fastest, the strongest of his era, the leader who sacrificed everything. And rather than watching that play out across dozens of episodes, we mostly heard about it, felt the echo of it, saw its aftermath. So Minato became larger in absence than most characters ever become in presence. His legend outgrew his appearances, and the less we saw, the bigger he seemed. It's a quiet lesson in how storytelling works. Kishimoto built this character backward, starting with a face on a mountain, a mystery with no name, and slowly filling in the life behind it. A harbor named for stillness, who became a symbol of speed. A father hidden in a son's reflection years before the truth was told. A hero we barely met, remembered more vividly than people we spent hundreds of chapters beside. And all of it began with a single, deliberate choice. To draw a man who looked like the boy at the center of everything, and let us feel the connection long before we understood it. What very few people realize is that the yellow flash of the leaf never actually named himself that. The title was given to him by his enemies. During the Third Shinobi World War, soldiers on the opposing side kept describing the same thing before dying. A flicker of yellow, a blur at the edge of vision, and then, in the space of a single breath, the comrade standing beside them would simply drop. They couldn't explain what they'd seen, because there was nothing to see. Only the color of his hair, moving faster than their eyes could follow. So the name wasn't a boast. It was the last thing a lot of people ever managed to say about him. And that leads directly to the question everyone eventually asks, which is how a single man could move like that. The natural assumption is speed. You watch him blink across a battlefield, and your brain fills in the obvious explanation. He must simply run faster than anyone alive. But that assumption is wrong, and the truth is far stranger. The technique behind the legend is called the Flying Thunder God, and it isn't a speed jutsu at all. It's a form of space-time teleportation. Minato places a special marker on a wall, on a kunai, on a person, and the moment he wills it, he doesn't travel to that spot. He's simply there. No running, no motion in between. The distance stops mattering entirely. So here's the contradiction that quietly reshapes everything you thought you knew about him. Minato is not the fastest runner in the series. On a straight track, others could outpace him. He teleports, which is a completely different thing, and it's why he seems to be everywhere on a battlefield at once. He isn't covering ground quickly. He's skipping over the ground altogether, appearing wherever he's left a marker, then vanishing before the enemy can even register that he arrived. The yellow blur his enemies described wasn't him running past them. It was the afterimage of a man who was already somewhere else. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that reputation reached a point most shinobi never come close to. The enemy village of Iwagakure, the Hidden Stone, gave their soldiers a very specific instruction regarding him: not to surround him, not to overwhelm him with numbers. The order was to flee on sight. If you see the yellow flash, do not engage, run. Think about how unusual that is for a military force to formalize. Entire armies are built on the idea of standing and fighting, of trusting numbers and coordination to carry the day. But against one man, that logic broke down completely. A flee on sight order is an admission that no formation, no tactic, no amount of soldiers changed the outcome. It underlines something the series returns to again and again, that a single ninja, in the right circumstances, could tip the balance of an entire war. But the most interesting part, at least from behind the scenes, isn't the legend itself. It's where the technique came from, because Minato didn't invent it. The Flying Thunder God originally belonged to the second Hokage, Tobirama Senju, one of the founders of the village generations earlier. Tobirama created the marking system, the whole concept of anchoring teleportation to a placed seal. But in his hands, it was a heavier, slower, more cumbersome thing. Powerful, yes, but not the instrument of terror it would later become. It required more preparation, more deliberate setup, and it never earned its creator a nickname that made armies retreat. So what Minato did wasn't discovery. It was refinement. He took an ancestral jutsu that had sat in the village's history for decades and reworked how it functioned, tightening it until the delay all but disappeared. He made the marking faster to apply and the teleportation nearly instantaneous, to the point where he could tag an incoming attack and redirect himself in the same instant it happened. In other words, he inherited a clunky old weapon and turned it into the deadliest technique of his entire generation. The tool was already there. What changed was the mind using it. And that detail says a lot about how the character was built. It would have been easy to give him an entirely original, one-of-a-kind power that belonged only to him. Instead, the design deliberately ties him back to the lineage of Hokage who came before, a thread connecting the village's founders to its future, passed down and improved rather than invented from nothing. It makes his strength feel earned, part of a continuity, the product of study rather than a lucky gift. So when you put it all together, the picture of the yellow flash sharpens. The nickname came from frightened enemies. The power came from an ancestor. The reputation came from a war he could turn almost single-handedly. And the myth of blinding speed, the one thing everyone assumes defines him, turns out to be a misunderstanding of what he was actually doing. He was never the fastest man on the field. He was simply the one who had already decided where he needed to be, long before anyone else could catch up. The story of Kushina Uzumaki begins not with romance, but with a kind of quiet disappointment. When she first met Minato as a child, she wasn't impressed at all. He was soft-spoken, almost delicate in the way he looked, with a face people sometimes mistook for a girl's. To a loud, headstrong girl like Kushina, he seemed flaky, unserious, the kind of boy who would drift through life without ever committing to anything. She saw nothing remarkable in him, and for a while, that judgment held. But Minato had already fallen for her. He simply hadn't found the moment to prove it. That moment arrived under the worst possible circumstances. Kushina, it turned out, carried something rare inside her, an enormous reserve of chakra and a bloodline the village hidden in the clouds wanted for themselves. So, they took her. Kumogakure ninja kidnapped her and tried to carry her out of the land of fire before anyone noticed she was gone. Here is where the small detail becomes the whole story. As she was being dragged away, Kushina did something almost no one would think to do. She pulled strands of her own red hair loose, one at a time, and let them fall behind her. A thin, deliberate trail scattered across the ground. It was a desperate gamble that anyone would even notice, let alone follow. Most wouldn't have, but Minato did. He tracked those faint red strands through the dark, following a path only he seemed capable of reading, and he reached her when no one else could. And when he found her, he didn't say something grand. He said something small. He told her that her red hair, the very hair she had always hated, the hair other children had teased her for, the hair she had spent years being ashamed of, was beautiful. That single line is the entire relationship. Kishimoto didn't need pages of dialogue or years of build-up. He sealed the two of them together in one sentence, turning the thing Kushina despised most about herself into the thing that saved her life and won her heart. Her opinion of him flipped completely, and it never flipped back. Now, here is where the record worth remembering starts to take shape. Because Kushina wasn't just a girl with unusual hair. She was an Uzumaki, and that name carries far more weight than it first appears. The Uzumaki clan were distant relatives of the Senju, blessed with life forces so strong they routinely lived well past 100 years, and famous throughout the ninja world for one specialized art above all others: sealing jutsu. Their mastery of seals was so respected and so feared that other nations eventually saw their village as a threat and destroyed it. The spiral symbol worn on the back of every hidden leaf flak jacket is, in fact, the Uzumaki crest, kept out of gratitude for that old alliance. So when Minato married Kushina, he didn't just gain a partner. He married directly into the clan responsible for the most complex sealing techniques in existence. And that is why, later, when he needed to understand and manipulate seals powerful enough to hold a tailed beast, he already had access to that knowledge. The man, remembered as a genius of space-time technique, owed part of his sealing mastery to the family he married into. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Because the reason seals mattered so much to this couple wasn't abstract. It was personal, and it was living inside Kushina herself. Long before Naruto was ever born, Kushina Uzumaki was the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed fox. She was its host. The strength people admired in her, the vast chakra, the endurance, all of it was tied to the fact that she carried the most destructive of the tailed beasts sealed within her body, exactly as her son would later carry it within his. This creates a statistic that almost no other character in the series can match. The Nine Tails wasn't randomly assigned to Naruto. It passed through 3 generations connected to Minato's own family. Before Kushina, the host was a woman named Minato Uzumaki, one of the very first Jinchuriki of the Nine Tails, and the wife of the first Hokage. Minato passed the burden to Kushina. Kushina, in turn, would pass it to Naruto. 3 hosts, all Uzumaki, all women until the very last, and all bound by blood and marriage into the same line that Minato joined the day he married her. So the fox that would define Naruto's entire life was never a stranger to his household. It had been handed down within his own family for decades before he drew his first breath. The seal that held it, the clan that understood it, the mother who carried it. Every piece was already in place, waiting. And it all traces back to a boy no one took seriously, following a trail of red hair in the dark, telling a girl that the thing she hated most was the most beautiful thing about her. From that quiet moment came a marriage, a clan bond, a mastery of seals, and the inheritance of the very beast that both parents would one day give their lives to contain. Behind the familiar appearance of the Nine-Tails sealing lies a decision far stranger and more deliberate than most people ever realize. On the night of Naruto's birth, everything should have been quiet. Kushina had been moved to a secret, guarded location because childbirth weakens the seal that holds a tailed beast in place, and the village couldn't afford to let the Nine Tails slip loose. Minato was there, holding the seal steady with his own hands, watching over both his wife and the newborn. For a few minutes, it worked. But a masked man had been waiting for exactly this moment of vulnerability, and he broke through the barrier, took the child hostage, and then tore the Nine Tails straight out of Kushina's body. You'd think losing a tailed beast would simply kill the host, and normally it would. But Kushina was an Uzumaki, and their unusual life force let her survive something that should have been fatal. That survival mattered, because it bought Minato just enough time to act. The masked man placed the freed fox under his control and turned it loose on the hidden leaf, aiming its rage directly at the village that Minato had sworn to protect. So in a single night, Minato went from a new father to a leader watching his home burn, forced into a choice with no good answer. Here's where the story turns against what you'd expect. The obvious move would have been to seal the entire Nine Tails back into an adult who could handle it. But Minato didn't do that. Instead, he split the fox in two. He divided its chakra into a yin half and a yang half, locked the yin half inside his own body, and sealed the yang half into his newborn son. It seems almost reckless to burden an infant with half of a monster, but Minato had a reason. He believed the masked man would come back for the fox, and by dividing it, he made it impossible for anyone to simply steal the whole beast again. Sealing part of it inside himself, where it would vanish when he died, guaranteed that half could never be recovered. To perform that sealing, Minato used the Reaper Death Seal, and this is where the counterintuitive part deepens. The Reaper Death Seal summons a death god, and the price for calling on it is the user's own soul. There is no version of this technique where the caster walks away alive. So when Minato began the seal, he already knew the outcome. He wasn't gambling on survival or hoping for a miracle. He had chosen to die before he ever started, trading his life to buy the village and his son a future. But here's what almost nobody knows. You'd assume a man sealing away his own life would spend his final chakra on the seal itself and nothing more. Minato did the opposite. He deliberately set aside a piece of his own chakra and placed it inside Naruto's seal, like a message left in a bottle. His plan was that this fragment would remain dormant for years, and that if the seal ever weakened or the Nine Tails ever threatened to break free, this stored piece of Minato would awaken and appear to help his son. It was a father planning to show up long after his own death. And that plan actually worked. During the Fourth Great Ninja War, when Naruto struggled to control the fox, that fragment of Minato's chakra emerged exactly as intended, meeting his grown son face to face and helping him master the very beast that had cost both his parents their lives. Kushina, still clinging to life, used the last of her strength to help hold the fox in place with her chains, and she chose to seal a portion of her own chakra into Naruto as well, so that she too could one day speak to him. So the child didn't just inherit a monster. He inherited two parents waiting quietly inside him, both of them betting everything on a future they would never see. And then there's the final, quietly astonishing detail. When Minato had only moments left, most people in his position would have passed their last words to a trusted comrade, someone who could carry a message, avenge a wrong, or protect what remained. Minato didn't. He entrusted his final words to a newborn who couldn't understand a syllable of them. He spoke to Naruto as if to a grown man, telling him not to grow up spoiled, to eat well, to study hard, and to be strong. But underneath those simple words was something heavier. Minato was placing his faith in the belief that Naruto would one day grow strong enough to break the seal himself, harness the Nine Tails, and finish what his father had started, undoing the disaster the masked man had set in motion. So the sealing that looks, on the surface, like a desperate act of sacrifice, was actually something more calculated. It was a plan spread across time, built by two people who knew they were dying, aimed at a son who wouldn't remember them, trusting entirely that he would grow into the person capable of carrying it through. And remarkably, everything they gambled on came true. If you look closely at Jiraiya, his master, you start to notice that almost nothing about Minato's life was inevitable. So much of it came down to a single teacher choosing to believe in a boy long before there was any reason to. Minato was Jiraiya's student, but the connection between them ran far deeper than the usual bond of mentor and pupil. Jiraiya was one of the legendary Sannin, a shinobi of enormous reputation, someone who had trained under the Third Hokage himself and had seen countless talented young ninja pass through the village. And yet, out of all of them, it was Minato he singled out. Jiraiya named him Hokage material long before anyone else took the idea seriously. At the time, it must have sounded almost reckless. Minato was gifted, certainly, but the title of Hokage is reserved for the strongest and most trusted person in the entire village. And here was Jiraiya quietly declaring that this quiet young man would one day carry it. Most people would have dismissed it as a teacher's pride. But Jiraiya turned out to be right, and that early belief became the foundation for everything Minato would eventually become. What makes it feel less like fate and more like a lucky accident is how personal the whole thing became. Jiraiya, for all his fame as a warrior, also thought of himself as a writer, and at one point he wrote a novel. The story followed a determined young protagonist who never gave up, and Jiraiya gave that character a name: Naruto. Now, this could easily have stayed nothing more than a small detail buried in an old book that few people ever read. But Minato had read it. And when Minato and Kushina had a son of their own, they reached back to that novel and named the child after Jiraiya's fictional hero. So the name Naruto wasn't chosen at random, and it wasn't chosen for its sound. It was a tribute, a way for a student to honor his teacher by carrying a piece of the man's own imagination into the next generation. A name that began as a character in a story quietly became the name of a real child who would one day change the world. Because of that gesture, something else fell into place almost naturally. When you name your son after your teacher's book, you tend to want that teacher close, and so Jiraiya became Naruto's godfather. Think about what that quietly created. Jiraiya had trained Minato. Minato had named his son after Jiraiya's novel. And now Jiraiya stood as guardian to that very son. 3 generations of teacher and student, all linked together through the same aging toad sage. It wasn't a grand plan anyone sat down and designed. It simply grew, one small choice building on another, until the entire lineage of the toad sage ran through a single family. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting, because the connection wasn't only sentimental, it shaped the way Minato fought and the power he was able to reach. Jiraiya's bond with the toads of Mount Miyaboku gave him access to Sage Mode, the ability to draw in natural energy from the world around him and fold it into his own strength. Minato learned this from the same toads, and by mastering it, he joined a very small group of humans who could balance that natural energy without losing themselves to it. But here is the part that makes Minato genuinely rare. He didn't stop at Sage Mode. He combined it with his own signature technique, the Flying Thunder God, the space-time jutsu that let him vanish and reappear across a battlefield in an instant. So Minato became one of the very few people ever to blend natural energy with teleportation itself, layering a power he inherited from his master onto a technique he had made entirely his own. It's a combination almost no one else in the story ever managed, and it existed only because a teacher and student happened to share the same toads. And this is where the story takes its most surprising turn, the one that feels less like destiny and more like a hope that had to be relocated. For a long time, Jiraiya believed there was a prophecy, that somewhere out there was a child of prophecy, a person destined to either save the world or destroy it. And for a time, Jiraiya was convinced that person was Minato. He looked at his student and saw the one who would bring peace. But Minato died young, giving his life to seal the Nine Tails and protect the village. So the prophecy Jiraiya had pinned on him seemed to die too. Except Jiraiya didn't let it go. Instead, he quietly transferred that same hope onto the newborn Naruto, the boy named after his novel, the son of the very student he'd once believed in. What began as a prophecy about the father became a prophecy about the son, and in the end, it was Naruto who fulfilled it, which means the belief Jiraiya first placed in Minato never really failed. It simply waited one more generation to come true. People rarely talk about Obito Uchiha, the masked man, as being anything more than a villain in a spiral mask. But the truth is stranger and quieter than that. The figure who attacked Konoha on the night of the Nine-Tails assault, the one who tore the fox loose and turned it against the village, was not a stranger at all. Years later, it would be revealed that behind that mask stood Obito Uchiha, and Obito had once been Minato's own student. That single fact reshapes the entire night. Minato did not die fighting some faceless outsider who wandered in from beyond the borders. He died standing against a boy he had personally trained, a boy who had fought beside Kakashi on the very same three-man squad under Minato's command. Obito had been declared dead years earlier, crushed on a mission during the war, his body left behind in a collapsing cave. Everyone who knew him grieved and moved on. So when Minato faced the masked man, he had no way of knowing he was looking at someone he had already mourned. That is what made the tragedy so personal. Minato was not just protecting the village from an enemy. He was, without realizing it, being killed by the consequences of his own past, by a student whose loss he never fully accounted for. The teacher who had shaped one of the great ninja of that generation was undone by another student he thought the war had already taken. Now here is where the fight itself becomes remarkable. Obito was, at that point, almost impossible to touch. His ability let attacks pass straight through his body, phasing him out of reach so that no blow, no blade, no jutsu could land. That is what made him so terrifying. You could not hit what refused to be solid. But Minato found the seam in it. He understood that Obito had to become tangible for the instant he attacked, and in that instant, Minato struck. He became one of the only people ever to land a decisive hit on the masked man, and, more importantly, he marked him with a flying Thunder God seal in the middle of the exchange. That seal is the quiet thread that ties this whole story to something much larger. Because Minato did not simply wound Obito that night, he tagged him, leaving a mark and a body of knowledge behind that would matter far more than anyone could have guessed. And that brings us to the strange contrast at the center of all this. Both Minato and Obito were shaped by loss. But what's really surprising comes next, because the same grief drove them in opposite directions. Obito lost the person he loved most, and that grief curdled into something cold. He came to believe the real world was not worth saving, that it should be replaced entirely by a dream, and he built his entire life around a plan to erase it. His pain turned him into a terrorist willing to burn everything down. Minato carried loss too. He would lose his own life that night, and he knew it. But his grief for what might happen to his village and his newborn son pushed him the other way. It fueled a final act of protection rather than destruction. Two students of loss standing across from each other, choosing opposite answers to the same question. That is the unexpected connection that makes this moment matter so much to the wider story. On the surface, it looks like a single tragic night, one attack, one sacrifice. But it was actually the opening move of a war that would not fully arrive until years later. Obito survived. He kept building his plan in the shadows, gathering power and allies, and the confrontation with Minato became the first time anyone had truly slowed him down. And the pieces Minato left behind did not vanish with him. The seal he placed, the understanding of how Obito's technique worked, the warnings he passed on, all of it lingered. When the Great War finally came, that knowledge became part of how the next generation learned to counter a foe who could otherwise not be touched. Minato had, in a sense, left a message across time, written into the body of the very enemy who killed him. So the man in the mask was never a random catastrophe. He was a former student, a grieving friend of Kakashi's, a boy the war had broken and hidden away, returning to strike at the teacher who had shaped him. And Minato, in his last hours, did more than seal the fox into his son. He drew a line in a fight most people could not even survive, and he left behind the first crack in a plan that had seemed unstoppable. It is a strange kind of symmetry, the teacher and the student, both defined by loss, both reaching for the future in completely different ways. One tried to end the world to escape his pain. The other give everything to protect it. And though Minato would not live to see how it ended, the mark he left that night quietly waited, just like his belief in his son, for the moment it would finally be needed. Curiously enough, Minato's legacy doesn't rest on the length of his rule, but on how little time he actually had to build it. When you look at the record, Minato served as the Fourth Hokage for a strikingly short stretch, likely under 2 years before the night everything changed. That's almost nothing in the life of a village that measures its history in generations. You'd expect a leader with so brief a tenure to fade quietly into the margins, remembered as a footnote between longer, more established reigns. But the opposite happened. Despite that short window, Minato is consistently ranked among the strongest leaders the Hidden Leaf ever had, mentioned in the same breath as Hashirama, the founder himself. So the first strange thing about his legacy is that it grew larger the less time he was given to earn it. And that pattern repeats outside the story too, in a way that's easy to overlook. In the popularity polls run by Shueisha, the magazine that published the manga, characters usually rise or fall based on how much they appear. More pages, more moments, more votes. Minato broke that rule. He shows up for only a handful of real scenes across the entire series, yet he repeatedly placed high in those rankings, climbing past characters who had dozens of chapters devoted to them. The tension there is obvious once you notice it. How does someone barely present stay so beloved? And the resolution is quietly telling. It proves that impact isn't measured by screen time. Readers didn't need to spend hundreds of pages with Minato to feel the weight of who he was. A few decisive moments were enough. You can trace part of that lasting impression to something purely visual, and it's simpler than you'd think. Minato wore a custom haori, a long coat draped over his shoulders, and down the back it reads, Fourth Hokage, in bold kanji. The coat was white, edged with a red flame pattern licking up from the hem, and that single design became so recognizable that it stopped being just clothing. It became a symbol. So when the story wanted to show that Naruto had finally grown into his father's shadow, it didn't need a speech. It simply gave Naruto his own version of that coat, an orange one, worn the same way, as a direct homage. The image alone tells you the torch has passed. One glance, and you understand a whole arc of inheritance without a word being spoken. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because the core of Minato's legacy is built on a contradiction most heroes never survive. We tend to remember great warriors for the battles they win. Minato earned the name the Yellow Flash on the battlefield, feared across enemy lines, a shinobi whole armies were ordered to flee from on sight. By every measure of raw skill, he was a champion. But that isn't what he's remembered for. His defining moment isn't a victory. It's a loss. On the night the nine-tailed fox attacked the village, Minato gave his own life to seal the creature away, sacrificing everything to protect a home he would never see again. So the counterintuitive truth is that the strongest ninja of his generation is honored most for the one fight he couldn't walk away from. He didn't win that night in any ordinary sense. He simply refused to let the village lose. And somehow, that costs him more, and means more, than any battle he ever conquered. Even the tools he left behind carried that same quiet weight, and one of them outlived him completely. Minato fought with a special kunai, a throwing knife, but its shape was unusual. 3 prongs instead of the standard single blade. That design wasn't decorative. Each of those kunai served as an anchor for his signature technique, the Flying Thunder God, a form of instant teleportation that let him vanish and reappear wherever one of those blades had been placed. So the knife wasn't really a weapon in the normal sense. It was a marker, a point on a map only he could reach. And long after he was gone, that 3-pronged silhouette remained one of the most recognizable weapon shapes in the entire series, instantly tied to his name. Naruto himself would later learn to use both the technique and the blade, meaning the very object that defined Minato's speed became another thread connecting father to son. When you step back and lay it all out, the shape of his legacy is almost gentle in its logic. A leader who ruled for less than 2 years, but stands beside the founders. A character who appears rarely, but ranks among the most loved. A coat that became a promise. A defeat that became his greatest act. A simple knife that became a legend. None of it depends on how long he was here. It depends entirely on what he chose to do with the little time he had. And maybe that's the truest measure of Minato Namikaze, that he never needed a long life to leave a lasting one. The mark he left behind kept working quietly in his absence, exactly as he intended, waiting patiently for the son who would one day carry it forward. Originally, Minato Namikaze wasn't meant to be a character at all, at least not one you could really know. When Masashi Kishimoto first sketched out the world of Naruto, the Fourth Hokage existed for one simple reason. Someone had to explain why an orphan boy was carrying a 9-tailed monster inside him. That was the whole job. Minato was a piece of backstory, a name attached to a sacrifice, a legend meant to sit quietly in the past and never step forward. For years, that's exactly what he did. He appeared in silhouette, in half-remembered stories, in the respectful hush of villagers who spoke about him, but rarely showed him. He was less a person and more a rumor with a title. But rumors have a way of getting out of hand, and this one did. The more Kishimoto kept Minato in shadow, the more readers leaned in, trying to see past the outline. Who was this man with the spiky blonde hair? Why did the village treat his memory with such quiet reverence? The mystery that was supposed to be a small piece of scaffolding slowly turned into one of the most asked-about corners of the entire series. And here's where a small design choice became something much bigger than intended. Kishimoto later admitted that he had drawn Minato to look like a grown-up version of Naruto on purpose. The resemblance wasn't an accident or a coincidence. It was planted deliberately, long before anything was ever confirmed on the page. That decision was meant to be a subtle seed, a quiet visual hint. But subtlety only works when your audience isn't paying close attention, and these readers were paying very close attention. So, instead of a gentle surprise waiting years down the line, the resemblance became a giveaway. Fans looked at the two faces, the same wild blonde hair, the same shape of the eyes, and they guessed the truth long before the story was ready to tell it. The father-son twist that was supposed to land like a revelation was, for many, more of a confirmation. Kishimoto himself later said that keeping the secret for as long as he did was genuinely difficult, precisely because he had built the clue right into the character's face. In a sense, the most famous twist of Minato's story was almost undone by the very design meant to support it. The hint worked too well. And that's the strange charm of it. A choice made to quietly foreshadow the future accidentally became the thing that let everyone see the future coming. It's the kind of happy mistake that ended up defining how people experienced the reveal, and it never really hurt the emotional weight when the moment finally arrived. If anything, the long wait made it sweeter, because readers had been holding that suspicion for so long that seeing it confirmed felt like being trusted with something they'd earned. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Because for a character this beloved, This central to Naruto's entire existence, Minato has remarkably little time on the page as a living, breathing person. Almost everything we know about him arrives secondhand. It comes through flashbacks, through the memories of people who loved him, through Kushina's warmth and Kakashi's grief, and Jiraiya's quiet pride. We rarely watch Minato simply live. We watch other people remember him living. His presence in the story is built almost entirely out of reflection, out of the impressions he left on everyone around him. You might think that scarcity would make him feel thin, underdeveloped, easy to forget, but it works the opposite way. Because we get so few glimpses of him, each one feels precious. A single smile, a single decision, a single moment of him kneeling to protect his newborn son carries far more weight than pages of ordinary scenes ever could. The very thing that should have been a weakness, so little screen time, became one of the reasons his brief appearances hit so hard. We fill in the gaps ourselves, and the imagination is a generous storyteller. Even his famous title grew from something smaller than raw power. Minato is remembered as the yellow flash of the leaf, and it's easy to assume that name came from overwhelming strength. But it didn't. It came from a single, terrifying reputation on the battlefield. His speed, his flying thunder god technique, meant that enemies would catch a blur of yellow, a flash of that blonde hair, and then it was already over. They learned to fear the color before they ever saw the face behind it. The name wasn't a boast about how mighty he was. It was a warning shared among soldiers who knew that if you saw yellow, you were already too late. So the man who began as a footnote, a convenient explanation for why a boy carried a monster, quietly became one of the most carefully remembered figures in the whole story. A background legend given a face that looked too much like his son. A secret that hid in plain sight. A hero we mostly meet through the memories of the people he left behind, which in the end may be exactly the right way to remember someone who died smiling. One often overlooked detail about Might Guy is how closely his story runs alongside the very man we've been talking about. Because before Guy became the beaming, green-suited symbol of hard work, he was a young shinobi of the same era as Minato Namikaze, coming up through the ranks during the Third Great Ninja War. They were prodigies of the same generation, breathing the same wartime air, shaped by the same losses. And that shared timeline is where the hidden connection begins to take shape. Here's the part that tends to slip past most viewers. Minato earned his legend by mastering speed itself, but he did it through space-time ninjutsu, folding distance with a single marked kunai. Guy, meanwhile, chased the exact same goal from the opposite direction. He couldn't teleport. He had no bloodline gift, no rare technique handed down to him. So he built his speed with nothing but his own body, through relentless taijutsu and the forbidden art of the 8 gates. Two men, the same golden generation, both reaching for the title of the fastest, but arriving there by roads that could not have been more different. That contrast wasn't an accident. Kishimoto seemed to design these two as deliberate mirror images, a quiet piece of thematic symmetry hidden inside the action. One path was talent refined into elegance. The other was willpower pushed past its breaking point. And the fascinating thing is that both paths led to nearly the same destination. Because when Guy opened the final gates, his raw combat speed could rival even the Fourth Hokage's teleportation. For a few impossible seconds, the man with no special gift moved fast enough to stand beside a shinobi who bent space and time. That's the Easter egg buried in their comparison. Minato was called the Yellow Flash, a nickname born from how quickly he crossed a battlefield. Guy, in his own peak, blazed with a red-gold aura when he opened the gate of death, and observers described him as fast enough to leave afterimages the eye couldn't follow. 2 flashes of the same village, one gold and one crimson, separated by method but joined by result. It's the kind of parallel that rewards a second look. But here's what almost nobody knows. The reason this comparison carries so much weight is that later stories treat Guy's absolute peak as one of the very few powers in the entire setting that could genuinely threaten a monster on the level of the strongest villains, the same tier where a Kage of Minato's caliber lives. When Guy unleashed his final technique, even Madara Uchiha, a man who had shrugged off nearly everything thrown at him, admitted he'd never learned the name of the shinobi who nearly ended him. That admission means something. It places a gateless, giftless taijutsu master in the same rarefied conversation as the fastest Hokage the Leaf ever produced. And that's exactly why the fandom argues about it to this day. Who was truly faster? The man who teleported, or the man who tore through the sound barrier on foot? It's an unanswerable question, but the fact that it's even askable tells you how carefully these two were balanced against each other. They were built to be compared. They were built to be 2 answers to the same riddle. Now here's where the circle quietly closes. Guy's lifelong rival was Kakashi Hatake, the cool, unbothered genius to Guy's loud determination. And Kakashi, of course, was Minato's own student, trained personally by the Fourth Hokage before Minato ever wore the title. So the whole web ties back together. Guy pushes Kakashi to grow through decades of self-declared challenges. Kakashi carries a piece of Minato's teaching in everything he does. And through that single thread, Guy is never more than 1 step removed from the Yellow Flash himself. The friendship circle of Konoha's greatest generation loops back to Minato no matter where you start. There's a gentle irony in all of this. Minato is remembered as the natural, the effortless prodigy who made speed look like grace. Guy is remembered as the opposite, the man told again and again that he lacked talent, who answered by working harder than anyone alive. Yet the two ended up occupying the same shelf in the village's memory, both spoken of as among the fastest fighters Konoha ever raised. One was gifted the summit, the other climbed it barehanded, and they met at the top. It's a small detail, easy to miss beneath the bigger battles and louder legends, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Every time Guy shouts about the power of youth, he's echoing a truth that Minato embodied in silence, that a shinobi's real strength lives in how completely they give themselves to protecting others. Different volume, same heart. So when you picture Konoha's fastest, don't picture just one man in a yellow coat. Picture two figures standing back to back across the same golden generation. One vanishing in a flash of light, the other burning red at the edge of his limits. Mirror images of a single idea carried by two very different souls, both racing toward the same quiet purpose, and both, in their own way, unforgettable. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Tobirama Senju, and it changes the way you look at everything Minato ever accomplished. Because when we talk about the Flying Thunder God technique, the jutsu that turned a single man into a legend, we tend to imagine it springing fully formed from Minato's mind. A stroke of impossible genius, a gift that belonged to him alone. But that isn't quite the truth. The technique wasn't his invention at all. It was created generations earlier by Tobirama Senju, the second Hokage, a man whose name rarely comes up when people list the fastest ninja who ever lived. And that's where it starts to get interesting. Because Tobirama's original version wasn't the seamless flash of light we remember from Minato. It was something rougher, something slower, something that felt more like an early prototype than a finished weapon. In its first form, the technique demanded preparation. Tobirama had to place special markers ahead of time, or throw kunai carrying a unique formula, seals inscribed onto the metal itself. Only then could he move to those points. So the power was there, undeniably, but it came wrapped in a limitation. You couldn't simply appear anywhere you wished. You had to set the board first, plant your markers, and only afterward could you travel between them. It was devastating in the right situation, but it asked for patience. And patience is a strange thing to ask of a technique built around speed. Think about what that means for a moment. The most famous teleportation jutsu in the entire world began its life as a tool with a catch. A brilliant idea held back by the very steps required to use it. In a sense, the version Tobirama carried was almost an unfinished draft, a concept that worked but hadn't yet become what it was meant to be. And for a long time, that's exactly where it stayed. A powerful, respected, but somewhat overlooked technique passed quietly down through the generations, waiting for someone to see what it could truly become. That someone was Minato. But here's the part worth slowing down for. Minato didn't just inherit the technique and use it as it was handed to him. He studied it, understood it, and then refined it so dramatically that it barely resembled the original anymore. Where Tobirama needed careful setup, Minato learned to cross a battlefield in what looked like a single instant, folding distance into nothing. The delay vanished. The preparation shrank. What had once been a slow, deliberate weapon became something that felt like a magic trick performed faster than the eye could follow. And because of that, because of the polish he added to an old idea, the world gave him the credit. They called Minato the Yellow Flash. They called him the fastest ninja alive. Almost no one stopped to remember the man who drew the first sketch. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because the story of the Flying Thunder God isn't just a story about one borrowed technique. It's a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Tobirama Senju wasn't a man of a single invention. He was, quietly, one of the most influential creators in the entire history of the Hidden Leaf. Consider the shadow clone technique, the jutsu that would one day define an entire generation of ninja, the very first real skill a young Naruto ever mastered. That, too, traces back to Tobirama. He created it. So the technique that launched the story of the Nine-Tails Host and the technique that launched the story of the Yellow Flash both share the same origin, the same forgotten hand. But it doesn't stop there, and this is where it turns almost unsettling. Tobirama was also the mind behind Edo Tensei, the reanimation technique. A forbidden jutsu capable of dragging the dead back into the world of the living, binding fallen warriors into service against their will. It's one of the most feared abilities ever conceived, a technique so dangerous that its own creator marked it as forbidden. And so you arrive at this strange, quiet realization. Some of Konoha's most iconic powers, the flash of teleportation, the army of shadow clones, the return of the dead, all flow back to a single Hokage that most conversations tend to skip over. There's a gentle irony in that. Minato is remembered as a genius, and he genuinely was one. His refinement of the Flying Thunder God was a work of real brilliance, the kind of leap that only a rare mind could make. But brilliance, more often than not, is built on inheritance. He didn't conjure his signature technique from nothing. He took an old, half-finished idea, a concept that had waited generations for the right hands, and he completed it. He gave the draft its final form. And maybe that's the quiet lesson tucked inside all of this. Even the fastest ninja who ever lived was standing on the shoulders of someone who came before him. The legend of the Yellow Flash was real, but it grew from a seed planted long ago by a man who rarely gets his name spoken aloud. An accident of history that turned a slow, forgotten jutsu into an icon. There's something most people don't know about Nagato. His story and Minato's story grow from the very same root. And that root is a single teacher whose name rarely gets spoken aloud in these conversations. Jiraiya. Long before he ever took Minato as his student, Jiraiya stayed behind in the Land of Rain during a war, and there he found 3 orphaned children scraping by in the ruins. Nagato, Yahiko, and Konan. He fed them, he sheltered them, and he taught them how to survive using the shinobi arts. So when we talk about the Yellow Flash and the man who would become Pain, we're really talking about 2 branches of one tree, planted by the same hand. But here's the tragic irony. Jiraiya believed in peace. He carried that belief his entire life, and he tried to pass it to every student who came under his care. He gave the same lesson to the orphan in the rain and to the prodigy back home in the leaf. Yet that single teaching split into 2 completely opposite outcomes. One student, Minato, took it and became a man who died protecting his village, throwing his own life away to seal a monster and save his people. The other student, Nagato, took the same words about peace and, after enough loss, twisted them into a plan that nearly destroyed a village instead. Same seed, same teacher, same dream of a world without pain. And yet, the road forked so completely that the 2 men became mirror images of each other. And that mirror is not an accident of the story. It's by design. When Masashi Kishimoto built Nagato's arc, he shaped it deliberately as a dark reflection of Minato's. Think about it. Both are gifted beyond their peers. Both study under Jiraiya. Both lose people they love to the endless cycle of war. But where Minato held on to hope, Nagato lost his. Kishimoto was quietly asking a hard question through these 2 characters. What happens when a talented student, given every gift, loses hope instead of holding on to it? Minato is the answer where hope survives. Nagato is the answer where it doesn't. So the 2 of them aren't just separate characters who happen to share a mentor. They're 2 possible endings to the same beginning. Now, there's a detail here that fans of raw power tend to overlook, and it says a lot about just how dangerous Nagato's circle really was. During Pain's assault on the leaf, attacks landed that killed ordinary ninja in an instant, wiping them out before they could even react. A single technique, the almighty push, could level buildings and erase entire streets of defenders in a heartbeat. That's not a small thing. It quietly tells you that the threat tied to Nagato was on a level where survival itself was the exception, not the rule. And only the very best could hope to escape it. But what's really surprising comes next. Because the story doesn't stop with 2 students walking opposite roads. It closes the loop. Years after Jiraiya first knelt down in the rain to feed 3 hungry orphans, his own death at the hands of Pain becomes the very thing that sends Naruto searching for answers. And when Naruto finally stands face to face with Pain, he isn't standing there alone. He's carrying his father's spirit of sacrifice, the same willingness to give everything for others that defined Minato. So the confrontation between Naruto and Pain is really the closing of a circle that Jiraiya began decades earlier. The teacher trained the orphan. The orphan became the enemy. The teacher trained the prodigy. The prodigy's son inherited that hope. And that son is the one who finally reaches the orphan's broken heart. Everything folds back on itself. And this is why Nagato's arc matters so much for understanding Minato, even though the two barely share a scene. Nagato is the shadow that gives the yellow flash's light its shape. Without him, Minato's sacrifice is just a heroic death. With him, that sacrifice becomes a choice, because Nagato shows us the other path, the road the yellow flash could have walked but didn't. Both men faced the same despair. Both watched the people they cared about die. Both had the raw talent to reshape the world by force. Minato chose to protect. Nagato chose to punish. So when you look at Minato's legacy, you're not just looking at a fast ninja who died smiling. You're looking at a man who stood at the same crossroads as Nagato and turned the other way. That's the quiet power of these two stories sitting side by side. Nagato deepens Minato without ever needing to share the frame with him. He shows the cost of losing hope, and by contrast, he reveals exactly what Minato held on to until his final breath. The legend of the Yellow Flash, then, isn't only about speed or technique. It's about a choice made under the weight of loss, the same weight that broke another student of the very same teacher. And understanding that makes the smile Minato died with mean something far heavier than it first appears. What very few people realize is that Hiruzen Sarutobi wasn't just a background figure in Minato's story. He was the man who made Minato's story possible in the first place. Hiruzen, the third Hokage, personally chose Minato Namikaze as his successor. Out of every gifted shinobi in the village, out of every seasoned veteran who had earned their stripes in war, Hiruzen looked at a young man barely into adulthood and decided that this was the one who would carry the hidden leaf forward. It was a striking choice because Minato became the fourth Hokage at a strikingly young age, younger than almost anyone expected the title to land on. And that decision tells you something about how the writers built Hiruzen's character. He was designed to be the quiet judge of talent, the elder who sees potential before the rest of the world catches up. But here's the detail that surprises people when they first piece the timeline together. After Minato died sealing the Nine Tails away, someone still had to lead the village. The fourth was gone. There was no obvious replacement waiting in the wings. So Hiruzen came out of retirement and took the hat back. Think about that for a moment. The third Hokage served before the fourth, stepped aside to let his chosen successor lead, and then returned to serve again after that successor was gone. In the entire lineage of Hokage, he's the man who held the position twice, bracketing Minato's short reign on both sides. From a storytelling standpoint, that's an elegant piece of construction, because it let the creator, Masashi Kishimoto, keep a familiar, grandfatherly authority figure at the center of the village, while the tragedy of the Nine Tails attack reshaped everything around him. And that single decision, the decision to pick up the hat one more time, quietly shaped the entire childhood of the boy at the heart of this whole saga. Because when Hiruzen returned to power, he inherited more than a village in mourning. He inherited an orphaned infant whose parents had just given their lives, a child most of the village either feared or resented. So Hiruzen made a choice that would define Naruto's early years. He protected the boy. He watched over him from a distance, made sure he had a place to live, made sure he was fed, made sure that despite everything, this child survived. But he did all of it while hiding the truth of who Naruto's parents actually were, keeping that knowledge locked away for years. Now, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, that protection came with a rule attached, one that reveals a lot about how carefully the early series was plotted. Hiruzen enforced a law forbidding anyone in the village from telling Naruto that Kurama, the nine-tailed fox, was sealed inside him. On paper, the reasoning was compassionate. It was a secret meant to shield the child, to give him a chance at a normal life without the weight of being a living prison for a monster that had nearly destroyed the village. Hiruzen believed that if the younger generation grew up alongside Naruto without knowing, they might simply see him as a boy rather than a threat. But here's the contradiction the story leans into, and it's a genuinely bittersweet one. The very secret meant to protect Naruto is what made him lonely. The adults knew, and they kept their distance in ways a child couldn't understand. Naruto grew up feeling isolated, acting out, desperate for any kind of recognition, and he never understood why. The kindness of the law and the cruelty of its effect were the same thing. That tension, a well-meaning rule that quietly wounds the person it's supposed to save, is one of the most human ideas in the early parts of the series, and it all traces back to a decision Hiruzen made with the best of intentions. So when you step back and look at the shape of it, something quietly moving comes into focus. The same leader who elevated Minato, who saw the Yellow Flash's potential and handed him the highest honor the village could give, spent his own final years guarding Minato's son. He raised up the father, and then he watched over the child. He gave Minato the hat, and after Minato was gone, he carried the burden of the family Minato left behind. There's a symmetry there that the writers clearly understood, because it turns Hiruzen into something more than a mentor or a placeholder ruler. He becomes the invisible bridge. The connection between the Yellow Flash's death and his son's eventual rise runs straight through the Third Hokage. Without Hiruzen choosing Minato, there is no Fourth Hokage. Without Hiruzen returning to power, there is no one to shelter the orphaned Naruto. And without Hiruzen's quiet, imperfect protection, the boy who would one day inherit his father's dream might never have survived long enough to chase it. So the man who died smiling and the boy who grew up alone were tied together by a single elder who stood between them, holding the village steady, keeping the secret, and waiting for the next generation to finally understand what he had carried all along. The story of Naruto Uzumaki, when you follow it back far enough, stops being the story of a lonely boy and becomes the story of an inheritance he never asked for, and for most of his life, never even knew he had received. Because the elder who stood between father and son, keeping the secret and holding the village steady, was really just buying time. Time for a technique to finish its journey across 2 generations. And that technique was the Rasengan. Here is the record that most people miss. The Rasengan was not something Naruto invented, and it was not something Jiraiya taught him from nothing. It was created by Minato Namikaze, Naruto's father, and the detail that makes it remarkable is how long it took. Minato spent 3 full years developing that single technique, 3 years of shaping raw chakra into a perfect, self-sustaining sphere that required no hand signs at all. In a world where most jutsu are learned from scrolls or copied in seconds, 3 years for one move is an astonishing figure. It tells you exactly how difficult the Rasengan actually is, and how few shinobi could have built it from the ground up. But even after 3 years, Minato was not finished. And this is the part that quietly reframes everything. The Rasengan, as he left it, was incomplete. Minato's real goal was never just the spinning sphere. He intended to combine the Rasengan with his own nature transformation, to fuse shape manipulation with an element and create something far stronger. He simply died before he could take that final step. So the most powerful technique associated with the Yellow Flash was, technically, an unfinished project. A prototype left on the workbench when its inventor ran out of time. Which means the version of the Rasengan that Naruto first learned was, in a sense, only half of the original dream. He learned to spin the chakra, to hold the sphere, to slam it into an opponent, But the elemental layer his father had imagined was still missing. And here is the quiet mathematics of it. Minato needed 3 years to build the base. Naruto, decades later, would need his own long, grueling training to add the missing piece, developing the Rasen Shuriken by combining the Rasengan with his wind-natured chakra. 2 shinobi, a generation apart, each pouring years into the same single technique, and neither of them, at the time, fully aware they were finishing each other's work. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. When Naruto added wind chakra to the Rasengan, he was not simply upgrading a move. He was, without knowing it, completing the exact step his father had planned and never lived to attempt. Minato wanted to merge the Rasengan with nature energy. Naruto did precisely that. So the son fulfilled the father's unfinished ambition, not out of loyalty, not to honor a memory, because for most of that journey, Naruto had no idea Minato was the inventor at all. He thought he was just getting stronger. In reality, he was closing a loop that had been left open since before he was born. That is why the Rasengan is one of the very few techniques in the entire series that can honestly be called a 2-generation creation. The father designed it and proved the base was possible. The son, unknowingly, supplied the final ingredient. Neither could have completed it alone, and the gap between their contributions is measured not in minutes, but in an entire lifetime. Kishimoto, the author, used this structure very deliberately. Instead of handing Naruto power as a reward, he made every increase in strength feel like the continuation of something older. Growth that doubled as inheritance, achievement that doubled as tribute. And the Rasengan is only half of what passed down. There is a second inheritance, and it is even more literal. Naruto became the Jinchuriki of the 9-tailed fox, the very same tailed beast that his father had once contained. Not a similar beast, not another of the 9, but the exact same 9 tails. Minato held its power in life. On the night he died, that same fox was sealed into his newborn son. So the bond itself was handed down, beast and burden together, from father to child in a single night. Statistically, in a world with 9-tailed beasts scattered across many nations, the odds of the same one binding a father and then his son are almost poetic in their unlikeliness. Yet that is exactly what happened. Put those 2 threads side by side, and the picture becomes very clear. Naruto inherited his father's signature technique and his father's exact prisoner, and he completed the first while carrying the second, all before he ever learned who his father truly was. So every time Naruto spins a Rasengan in his palm, there is a quiet second meaning underneath the light and the motion. It is a technique built by a man he barely met, finished by a son who did not know he was finishing it, powered by the same fox that man once held. In the calmest possible sense, every Rasengan Naruto forms is a conversation, a slow, wordless exchange with the father he never really had the chance to know. Behind the familiar appearance of Kakashi Hatake, the silver hair, the covered eye, the book he never seems to finish, there's a connection to Minato that most people overlook entirely. Because long before Kakashi ever stood in front of a young Naruto and explained the rules of a simple bell test, he was a student himself, and the man teaching him was Minato Namikaze. That's the quiet symmetry at the center of it all. The same teacher who shaped the father would, years later, shape the son. One man, guiding 2 generations of the same family, without either of them fully understanding how tightly their lives were already wound together. And here's where it becomes genuinely poignant. Kakashi wasn't just any student. He was a prodigy. The kind of talent that graduates young, makes Chunin absurdly early, and carries the weight of expectation before he's old enough to know what to do with it. He was placed on Team Minato as a boy who believed rules mattered more than people, that the mission always came before the comrade. But the lessons he learned under Minato, about teamwork, about the cost of leaving someone behind, reshaped him completely. And those exact lessons became the foundation of the bell test he would one day hand to Naruto. The test wasn't really about the bells. It never was. It was about the truth Kakashi had learned the hard way, decades earlier, at Minato's side. Now, there's a technique here that most fans associate purely with Kakashi, the Chidori. That crackling burst of lightning, the sound of 1,000 birds. It's his signature, one of the very few techniques he created entirely on his own. But here's the counterintuitive part that reverses what you'd assume. Kakashi developed the Chidori as a young man, chasing raw speed and power. Yet the technique had a fatal flaw. Moving that fast, in a straight line, created a blind spot. A moment where Kakashi simply couldn't see an enemy stepping into his path. And the person who recognized that danger, who understood the weakness better than anyone, was Minato himself. So think about the reversal there. You'd expect a mentor to celebrate his student's most dangerous new weapon. Instead, Minato cautioned him against it. He warned Kakashi not to rely on the Chidori, because the very speed that made it lethal also made it a liability. Minato saw that a technique built for offense had quietly turned into a way for his student to get himself killed. It's a strange truth. The one man who could have helped perfect that move was also the one telling Kakashi to be careful with it. Minato even planned to pair it with his own space-time technique to cover that blind spot so Kakashi could use it safely. But he never got the chance. But here's what almost nobody knows. That warning, that unfinished promise, is part of why Kakashi carried Minato's memory so carefully into everything that came after. Minato died before he could close the loop on the Chidori, and Kakashi, the surviving student, inherited more than a technique. He inherited a philosophy. The belief that friendship and sacrifice weren't weaknesses in a shinobi, but the entire point of being one. That idea didn't come from nowhere. It came from Minato, and from the losses Kakashi suffered while standing beside him. So, when Kakashi eventually took charge of Team 7, something quietly remarkable was happening, even if no one in that clearing understood it yet. Naruto, the boy who never knew his father, was being taught by the very same man his father had once taught. The values Minato lived by: protect your comrades, never abandon your friends, understand that strength means nothing without the people beside you, flowed straight through Kakashi and into Naruto. The circle was closing, and Naruto had no idea. To him, Kakashi was just the lazy teacher with the mask and the orange book. He couldn't have known he was standing at the end of a line that stretched all the way back to the father he never met. And that's the detail worth sitting with. Kakashi became a kind of living bridge, not a monument, not a memory carved in stone, a person walking around, carrying the Yellow Flash's teachings forward one conversation at a time. Every time he corrected Naruto's stance, every time he explained why the mission mattered less than the people on it, he was passing along something Minato had handed to him years before. The lineage wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in habits, in warnings, in the quiet way one generation shapes the next. So the Chidori's blind spot, Minato's caution, the bell test, the lessons about sacrifice, they all connect through this single, understated figure. Kakashi didn't just teach Naruto jutsu. He delivered, almost invisibly, the inheritance of a father to a son who had no way of recognizing it. And when you understand that, Kakashi stops being a side character and becomes something quieter and more important. The thread that ties the Yellow Flash's teachings to the next generation of Konoha. The link nobody announced and almost nobody noticed, holding two eras of the same village gently together. If you look closely at Minato Namikaze, you find one of those rare cases where the whole character grew out of a single lucky idea. Masashi Kishimoto has said, quite plainly, that the technique came first. He wanted a jutsu that let a man cross a battlefield in an instant, a yellow blur that was there and then gone, and only afterward did he build a person around it. So Minato didn't arrive with a technique. The technique arrived, and Minato was invented to justify it. That's an unusual way for a hero to be born, but it explains so much about who he became. Now, because of that reputation for speed, most people assume the Flying Thunder God is about running faster than anyone alive. It seems obvious. He's called the Yellow Flash, after all. But here's the surprising part, the detail that quietly rearranges everything you thought you understood. Minato doesn't actually run fast at all. Not really. What he does instead is mark a location with a special seal, usually placed on his signature three-pronged kunai, and then he instantly warps to that mark. There's no sprinting involved. The blur people saw wasn't a man moving quickly. It was a man appearing where a mark already waited. So the Yellow Flash, the fastest shinobi in the story, is technically a teleporter who barely needs to move his feet at all. And once you understand that, his legend during the Third Shinobi World War starts to make a different kind of sense. If he were simply fast, you could try to keep up, or corner him, or overwhelm him with numbers. But you cannot outrun someone who is already standing behind you. That's why his nickname didn't just impress enemies, it frightened them. Iwagakure, the hidden stone village, reportedly issued a flee-on-sight order against him. Think about what that actually means. An entire military village told its soldiers not to fight this one man, but to turn and run the moment they saw him. Not a squad, not an army, one person. So the accident of a teleportation jutsu became the reason a whole nation instructed its warriors to retreat rather than engage. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting, because Minato's most famous image wasn't fully his own invention either. The flame-edged white haori, the long coat with Fourth Hokage written down the back, became so tightly bound to him that it stopped being clothing and started being identity. But the truly quiet twist is what happened to that coat afterward. Years later, his son Naruto wears the very same style of coat. Not a tribute worn for a single scene, but the same look, closing a loop that stretches across the entire series. A father dies, an infant survives, and decades later, that child pulls on the coat his father made famous, without either of them ever getting to share the moment. So a piece of costume design becomes one of the gentlest emotional threads in the whole story, a link nobody in the village had to announce, because the image said it for them. But the happiest accident of all, the lucky twist that genuinely changed everything, comes from that same teleportation seal you already know about. On the night the Ninetales attacked Konoha, Minato was fighting for the survival of his entire village against a force of pure destruction. And the beast, Kurama, was not something you could simply outfight. But remember how his technique works. He marks a location, and then he warps to it. So in the middle of that chaos, Minato reused the exact same seal from his teleportation and placed a mark directly onto the Ninetales itself. It's a small motion, almost invisible in the storm of that night. But it's the whole game. Because with the beast now marked, Minato could later warp the creature away, moving something the size of a mountain by treating it like just another point in space. And that's the detail that surprises so many fans when they finally notice it. His speed,
the thing everyone remembers him for, was never really about winning fights at all. It was a tool for sealing. The teleportation, the kunai, the yellow blur, all of it existed so that in the most desperate moment of his life, he could move an unmovable thing and protect the people he loved. So the jutsu that came first, the one Kishimoto built the man around, turned out to be exactly the tool the story needed at its darkest hour. Nothing about that was planned by the character. It simply fit, the way lucky things sometimes do.
When you lay it all out, Minato's whole existence has this quality of fortunate coincidence, quietly becoming destiny. A jutsu invented before the man, a nickname that terrified a nation not because of raw power, but because of a clever loophole in how space works. A coat that outlived him and found its way onto his son. And a marking technique meant for battlefield movement that ended up sealing away a tailed beast and saving a village. None of it looks designed from the inside. It looks like a series of small, lucky turns, each one leading naturally to the next, gently building a legend out of accidents that happened to land in exactly the right place. Tonight, we drifted through the quiet corners of the Naruto world, tracing its secrets and small legends, all the way to Minato Namikaze, the yellow flash who died smiling. Thank you for wandering these stories with me, as sleep settles softly over you now. Let this gentle glow fade like a candle and carry you into calm. Sweet dreams.